Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a Friday Reads video. It's really going to be a wrap-up of the first half of January. The first thing that I read this year was This Place, 150 Years Retold, which is a large comics collection with an Indigenous Canadian focus that was released for the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation in 2017. If you watched my video about stalking school libraries, this is a book that I saw being sold for some of the high schools. It is a collection by a variety of authors and a variety of artists covering, as it says, the Indigenous history of Canada. Not all of the stories were particularly compelling, but I think there's a usefulness to a collection like this where a lot of the history is not widely known, and the goal is more to educate than it is to entertain. Interestingly, looking at the biographies of the various artists, authors, and illustrators, all of the writers on this project were of Indigenous heritage, but most of the artists seemed not to be, and that seemed like an odd choice for the people producing this. But that's what it was. It was interesting. I did learn things. I felt, as with any collection where there are multiple authors and artists, not all of it was particularly to my taste, and not all of it was as engaging as I thought it could have been. But I did think in terms of being an educational product, especially one that is being sold to schools, I did think this seemed useful in that sense. The next thing that I read was also a comic, and that was volume 14 of What Did You Eat Yesterday? This is a cuisine manga series that I talk about at either the beginning or the end of just about every year, because that's what the localization schedule has been for this. This is a series that it's primarily about this 50-something gay couple who cook to save for retirement, because their concern is that by not having children, who's going to support them in their old age, so they better save money by cooking at home. And it presents their slice of life things alongside recipes. And I think one of my favorite parts of this, aside from the recipes, is the kind of ordinary issues that they run into. One of the personal moments in this is that one character is going with his elderly parents to pick out a potential place for their remains to be stored after they die. And then there's a lot of other bits primarily about their work lives. And unlike a lot of cuisine manga series, this has recipes that one would actually make. One of the ones in here is porridge. They make salads. They make things you could actually cook. I've always appreciated that about this series. I don't have a lot to say about it because it is book 14, but if you like cuisine manga and wish it had more home cooking rather than the fancy restaurant style cooking, this is a great book to pick up. I also read a book that I talked about in one of my last library hauls of the year in December, and that was There Has to Be a Knife by Adnan. This was described to me in the wrong way, and I'm mildly concerned about the fact that it was described to me in the wrong way. I had seen someone talking about this online, and they described it as being set in Scarborough. It is not. It's about characters who are from North York, and I feel like people who are not from Toronto might not appreciate the distinction, but I feel like making that mistake suggests to me that they felt like it's a story about petty criminals from recent immigrant backgrounds, so it must be Scarborough, and like, that's not good. That's not a mistake because it is repeatedly mentioned that these characters are from North York, so for somebody to make that mistake is really fishy. Not good. In any case, this book follows a main character whose ex-girlfriend, who he had been with for 10 years prior to their breakup 6 months before, has just committed suicide. And he's kind of having a quarter-life crisis. He's in his mid-20s. And he just makes a lot of poor choices, and he's bad at his job. He was not a good boyfriend. He's not great as the kind of piece on the side of this woman he's quasi-dating. Everyone he works for, and most of his friends, with one exception, are just not great people, and not in a particularly interesting way. There are things in here that could be interesting. At one point, he's committing some petty crimes, and the police try to get him to snitch and go into other situations where he could spy on people, and he's terrible at it. And in his own mind, he's presenting it as a moral quandary, but really we're just seeing him as somebody who's just not very good at things, and not in a particularly interesting or compelling way, unfortunately. I liked the writing style of this. It's quite stream of consciousness, and there are no quotation marks, so the dialogue and the internal thought processes aren't really differentiated, so you have to pay a little bit more attention to that, which I liked. I liked a lot of the local flavor when he's talking about demographics and Fairview Mall. I enjoyed a lot of that. I thought that was very recognizable for Toronto people. But overall, I think the book was just a bit of a letdown because there seems to be enough happening, but the main character is so blasé about his own life and everything else that you get caught up in that and it doesn't feel like anything. So it was fine, and I stylistically enjoyed some of the choices, but I just thought it was, okay, it was readable, but it wasn't compelling, and it wasn't particularly deep, and it dealt with topics where it could have been a lot deeper than it was. So around the same time that I was reading that, I also finally finished Alexander Chee's How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. I followed the advice that people left on my last wrap-up where I commented that I had stalled out on the middle of that because he has a novel writing list in the middle that is very out of place compared to all the memoir bits that came before it, but he does, as everybody said, return to the memoir bits afterwards, so it did improve for me there, and I did enjoy hearing more about his family and life and all of that. So yes, thank you to everybody who commented, and anybody who's reading that, just skip that novel writing list in the middle, because that just was not that good. So then I went back to my usual depressing nonfiction, and I read another one of Svetlana Alexievich's oral histories, and that was Last Witness, an oral history of the children of World War II. This, if you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen me describe this as a litany of war crimes, and it really is. It's a look at people who were between the ages of about 2 and 16 during the Second World War in the Soviet Union, and it is just horrific. There are a few people who didn't witness just war crime after war crime, but yeah, it's such a horror show. And I don't know why I expected it not to be. I had maybe expected about a quarter of the stories to be like that, but they were just all horrific. It was absolutely worth reading, and I think in a lot of ways this was more touching than anything else I've read of hers, and I mean all of her books are depressing oral histories, so but yeah, it was, I don't even know how to talk about it. Stylistically, it is exactly what all of her books are. She interviewed people and took her parts out, so you get these monologues from different people, but yeah, it's horrific stuff. And then I followed that, so I don't even know what else to say about that because it was so depressing, even by my standards, and I read a lot of depressing stuff. After that, I read a book that a lot of people on BookTube have been talking about, and that was The Collected Schizophrenias by Esmé Weijun Wang. This is a collection primarily of memoir bits with some research added in. She has a schizoaffective disorder diagnosis and talks about having one of these 3 schizophrenia family mental illnesses that terrifies even the people who are otherwise open-minded about mental illness. And it is interesting from that perspective just because you don't see that many of these style of memoirs. There are certainly piles of depression and bipolar memoirs, but other than The Center Cannot Hold in this, there's not a lot of schizophrenia family mental illness memoirs. It is very interesting to look at things through her eyes. She doesn't dig down, I think, into the guts, if you will, of mental illness in the way that some mental illness memoirs will, although it feels like in this case it's just because that would be too traumatic and more likely to trigger psychosis for her. There is also a weird amount of focus on that she went to Ivy League universities and wears designer clothes, and a very look at this, which felt like it was supposed to be reminding us of her humanity when we do tend to dehumanize people with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder and whatnot. But it also felt a lot like, okay, I get it. You're of a certain class. And, I mean, obviously being of a certain class is the reason that she's able to be a lot more successful than a lot of people with these mental illnesses would be. But at the same time, at a certain point, you do say, I don't need to know about your designer clothes, and I've heard about your Ivy League education, thank you. It goes off into a kind of spiritualist, like healing crystals and that kind of thing at the end, which lost me a bit. But I did appreciate reading this just because it is written from a perspective that we don't hear that often. So the fact that I didn't enjoy the end couple of essays feels like it would be missing the point. I didn't think that those were particularly compelling unless you're into that kind of spiritualist stuff, but I think as a perspective that isn't heard very often, I think this is still worth reading, even though I was frustrated with elements of it as a book on its own, which I think is a dilemma with a lot of memoirs. And I did read a couple of lighter things. I read a romance novel called Drawn to the Marquess by Bronwen Evans, which is a period romance between a woman whose husband may or may not have been murdered and a man who is basically a known playboy, and his kind of ridiculous excuse for being a known playboy is that he has retinitis pigmentosa, although they don't call it that, they just call it he's going blind, and he wants to sleep with as many women as he can before he loses more of his vision, which I think is ridiculous. But he's also an ex-spy, so this woman gets him to investigate her husband's death, but his payment is going to be that he tries to seduce her. It's ridiculous. It wasn't particularly good, but it wasn't particularly terrible, so whatever, there we go. I did think it was interesting because you see a lot of kind of Regency-type romances in which a man comes back from the Napoleonic Wars blind, but I've never seen one in which the man, and there's somewhere the woman is slowly going blind, and drama. But it was interesting to see that with the male character, just because that's not something you see every day, but it's kind of ridiculous. And then finally, the other kind of light piece that I read was I read volume 1 of the Avant Gardes, which is a comic series that a lot of people who read the style of light comics on BookTube have talked about. A lot of people have described it as being a sports comic, but I would say it's not. It's about a group of university or college students who are starting a basketball team at a school that doesn't traditionally have sports teams. And it's mostly an excuse to have drama between the leader of this team and this girl that she's trying to recruit, who she also has a crush on, basically. So it's a cutesy post-high school type story, but it's not really a sports story. Like, I wouldn't compare this to something like the basketball manga Slam Dunk or something like that. It's just not that. And I think I was hoping for something more like that. So this is fine, it's cute. And I'll insert some of the art here. But yeah, it was just cute. But I didn't feel like it did anything beyond be cute and kind of fun. So I was disappointed, but maybe that's because I was expecting something like Slam Dunk or Real or, oh, what's the volleyball manga? I'm forgetting the name. But, you know, something more sports focused, and it just isn't sports focused. It's kind of relationship. Cutesy, I want to say teenage drama, but I think they're all supposed to be slightly older, but you know what I mean. Anyway, that's been my reading of the past couple of weeks. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.